This is another war story, and boy was it ever a war story. And we're talking about an Alero that had gone 100,000 miles without giving any trouble at all. Had the 4-cylinder, the Quad 4. Some of you might remember seeing the Quad 4 if you've ever opened the hood on the GM car and couldn't see any spark plug wires or coils or anything. You see an engine there, but you don't see any spark plug wires or coils or anything. And this thing had a rattling noise coming from the engine area. You could rev it up, and when you were coming back off, you'd hear it going, make a funky rattling noise. It sounded like some kind of a chain, although it didn't really sound like a timing chain to me. It sounded like something different. And the crazy thing about it is, you could take your stethoscope and touch that engine anywhere you wanted to touch it when this noise was going on, and you could not pick it up. You could not pick this noise up touching the engine anywhere, but you could hear it loud as daylight. If with the windows up in the car, you could hear it standing in front of the car, you could hear it everywhere. And it was always when you'd give it the gas and you'd be letting off. It wasn't going in, it was coming back out of it. It was a tip out situation. So tip ins when you're going in, tip outs when you're going out. And that's what was going on here. So they took it to a GM dealer, small dealership, and they thought they pinpointed the problem as a loose catalyst brick. Have you ever heard of a loose catalytic converter brick dancing around in the catalyst, making a racket? They figured that's what it was. So they got a universal catalyst from the parts store, and they welded it into the pipe and all of that. And what was interesting about that was the car didn't make any noise at all for about 2 weeks. And so then the sound came back. And what these country folk around here always say, when you work on something that you think you fixed and it's not fixed, they come back and they say, it's just like it was, it's just like it was. Well, these folks here pulled in there back at the dealership, and while nobody was rude, the Alero owners were told that we can't help you with this, and I think they probably figured that the car had too many miles on it. Did you tape that wire harness up? Huh? You didn't tape it up, did you?
No, I did.
No, if you didn't tape it up, you got to start over. Get you some new wires and start over. All right. Supposed to tape it up. You didn't do the whole exercise. You just made a daisy chain. Yeah. No, you didn't tape it up right. You're supposed to tape it up like a wire harness. You got to start over too. You got to. Right. Yeah, you got to go all the way, just like they do. Tape it all the way up. Yeah. Bad. I can't believe that. He messed it up. Didn't do the job right.
They didn't tell us that.
Both y'all got worksheets, so you cannot pin it on nobody else.
Yeah.
Nice, yeah.
Well, everybody else did it right except for you guys. So, I mean, you know what I'm saying? The people that have done it anyway. One way or another. But that's a puzzling circumstance, what we got going on here. The dealer was probably figuring they were going to get some money in there into this thing that they didn't want to, and it would wind up costing more than the car was worth, and they didn't want to find themselves in that situation. And, but does an engine knock always mean something that's loose? Not necessarily. You can have engine knocks for other reasons besides something being loose. And at this particular point, when I tell the story of my roommate, Kent, he bought a little rail buggy. And this was in 1978. He bought this rail buggy. My dad had a Volkswagen bug shop, and I'd worked with him for a long time. But I hadn't worked on a bug for a while. And he says, can we rebuild the motor on my rail buggy? I said, yeah, we can do that. And so I threw all of that. We pulled it all to pieces and put rings and stuff in there and put it all back together. And when we cranked it up, and it ran really, really strong. As a matter of fact, if you took off on that thing in first gear, it would literally jerk the front wheels off the ground 3 feet. It was that powerful. But the longer it ran, the more it made a noise, a sort of a knocking noise. And it didn't sound like any knocking noise I had ever heard. It wasn't like a rod knock. It was different. It was something else. And so we shut everything down. I called my dad, and he says, of course, I had to walk in the house and dial the phone like this because we didn't have push button phones or anything, or even cell phones back then. So he says, you put the pistons in backwards. And I said, well, there's an arrow on top of the piston. He says, you remember which way it's supposed to be pointing? And I went, yeah. It's supposed to be pointing toward the flywheel, which on a Volkswagen Bug is the front. He says, now, if you can put up with that knocking it noise, it will outrun the stew out of one that's put together right. So I said, well, I don't think we want to hear that. It seems to me like it'd come apart eventually. So I took it all to pieces and we flipped the pistons around so the arrows on the top of the pistons were pointing at the flywheel instead of the belt. See, on a normal engine, you're thinking the belts would be in the front, the flywheel's the back. On a bug engine, it's different because the engine's in the car backwards, it's in the back, right? So anyway, that was a strange thing. Anyway, so that was the, now it wouldn't pull the wheels off the ground anymore, but it didn't knock either, and it sounded real good when it was running. But there's more than a few of them that'll knock if the pistons are installed backwards because of the way the pistons are weighted and everything. But that wasn't the case with this Alero because the pistons hadn't been removed. The engine was together the whole time. It sounded more like a chain than anything else. And if you screwed the end off your stethoscope and put that stethoscope on and got it to make the noise, and you held that open end of that stethoscope without touching up to the oil pan, it was really, really, really loud right there. Okay, so I put it all, you know, we wanted to find the reason for the noise here, you know. Now there's two chains in this engine. One of them drives the camshafts and the water pump, another smaller chain that drives the balance shaft. That's the timing chain. The timing chain don't drive the balance shaft. There's a balance shaft that's driven off the front of the crankshaft with a little small bicycle type chain that you actually can adjust the tension on that chain. And so it sounded like it was happening at about twice crankshaft speed. And that would be the balance shaft because the balance shaft is spinning, you know, about that. You know, it had a gear about this big around on the crank and one about half that big on the balance shaft. So anyway, so I wasn't really all familiar with this particular engine and a problem like this, and the GM shop manuals and TSBs didn't have anything to offer on a noise like that. So I didn't want to draw vast conclusions with half vast information, right? So what I basically did is I put in a call to Randy Wilson, and he's the Porkett GM dealer. He said that they had replaced a lot of these balance shaft assemblies in those engines because of that noise. And the balance shafts, if some of you guys have seen it from last semester, is that big old thing that was sitting up here, everybody took apart, put back together. That's the balance shaft off of that car. And there's a special tool that you have to put on it in order to time the balance shaft when you're putting it back on the car and all that kind of thing. And it includes the oil pump too, so you can't just take it off, right? And you know, back when Ford Contours first came out with their 4-cylinder engines in them, there was a vibration that you'd feel, and you might notice that on some engines you'll feel a vibration idling if they're a 4-cylinder, because what the combustion events happen every how often. How many degrees of crankshaft rotation between combustion events on a 4-cylinder? Somebody's going to know. Remember, on a 4-cylinder, 4 into 720 is 180. So every half a crankshaft turn, you got a firing event, and what that means on a 4-cylinder engine is just trying to jump up and down all the time. And so the balance shaft is basically countering this, right, to make it smooth out and all that kind of thing. But on those old Ford Contours, we actually were changing radiator supports and putting steering column dampers in there and just all kinds of stuff. And they were scrambling to try to get that going. But anyway, the price of that balance shaft, though, was $400. And I'm always spooked when I'm buying something that expensive. But since I was hearing it so loud in the oil pan area, and I couldn't directly hear it. See, that's actually up inside the oil pan where you wouldn't hear it if you were touching anything. You know what I mean? And so I went ahead and pulled the, you know, sold them on the idea, and we pulled it all apart. I had to buy a $45 special tool that, you know, puts the shafts in time and all that. And it's got these gears on there, but it's got left-hand thread, you know, that screw does. And incidentally, if the shop manual doesn't tell you something's got left-hand threads, you're in a mess. And there's another little war story pause here. I was mentioning this to somebody the other day. That Park Avenue Ultra that had the supercharger on it, the supercharger belt was driven, you know, it was a belt all into itself. And it went around a pulley up in the front of the motor, kind of up top, it's easy to get to. And the bearings went out in that pulley. And so we were, you know, going to change out the pulley, the bearing in the pulley. And so we started trying to take that bolt out. It was like a T50 Torx, you know. And the guy that was working on it worked on it. He said, man, I can't break this thing loose. And it turned out at the end of the day that it was left-hand thread, and there's no reason for that thing to be left-hand thread because the pulley turns clockwise, which if you got right-hand thread, that would tend to tighten the bolt, right? Usually if a pulley turns counterclockwise, they're going to put left-hand thread so that it won't loosen itself up. And he had actually kept trying to turn it to the left to take it off until he wiped the threads out of the aluminum behind it. So we helicoiled it and put a 10 millimeter 1.5 thread pitch bolt in there with an appropriate washer, and I guess that's still on there today. But you can look in the shop manual anywhere you want it to, and it never tells you anywhere that that bolt's left-hand thread. And there's no reason for it to be left out. Stupidest fool thing I've ever seen. On this one, it's different though. So we put the alignment tool on the balancer and install and turn the engine 90 degrees away from cylinder number 1 TDC in either direction. The balancer can be assembled and sprocketed to the engine. And the GM shop manual, now listen to this. This is the height of stupidity. The GM shop manual calls for a 40 thousandths inch brass feeler gauge to be inserted between the chain tensioner and the chain while you're tightening it up. That's going to create the right tension, and it won't be too tight and it won't be too loose, because that 40 thousandths brass feeler gauge will be just the right amount of resistance to that. But it's got to be brass, it can't be steel. You will not find a 40 thousandths brass feeler gauge anywhere. Not from Snap-on, not from anybody else I've ever seen. You will not find one. 35, but not 40. And so what I did was I got a piece of an antifreeze jug, which maybe this wasn't appropriate, but I cut a piece, measured it with 40 thousandths, put it in there. Didn't have quite as much resistance to bending as the brass one would have. We tightened that thing up, buckled it down, and all that. You can look it up in there if you want to. This is 99 Alero, by the way. But 3 pounds of pressure was supposed to be applied to the tensioner before you torque the bolt. Well, that's peachy, you know, if you can find the right feeler gauge, but we couldn't find one. Anyway, we put the engine back together, had a few bouts with getting the chain tension just right, and we pulled the pin, put it back on, installed it about 4 times. But after we got rid of the noise, it was about 3 months, they didn't hear nothing else. It was perfect, just like that. And everybody's really happy. Well, after 3 months, it started making a noise again. It kind of sounded like the same noise. So they brought it back in there, and we fooled with that, and we even pull the engine out and replace the gears and the chain on that little thing, but we still had issues with that noise. And then it turned out that the noise that we were hearing was due to, and let me go over here and look at this. I'm going to show you a couple of pictures right up here. That's the car right there. See the car? All right, now that's the balancer. See the tool down there on the left? That tool, you remember, some of you might remember seeing that last semester. All right, that's that tool. Now right here is the timing chain tensioner. It turned out that the noise we were hearing when it came back 3 months later was the timing chain tensioner problem. It was being caused out. We got that cover off, and we were cranking it with the cover off and listening to it and all. We discovered, you know, this is an operated by oil pressure type piston, and some of these on the older models had a ratchet sort of a thing on them. And the water pump is driven by the timing chain on this one too, which is kind of the craziest thing I've ever seen. On the earlier 2.4s, you could take a couple of bolts out and pull the water pump out of the gear that was being driven by the chain and put it back in and change the water pump in about 30 minutes. And then they decided that was too easy for the mechanics, and so they made the gear a part of the water pump, so you had to pull the front off the motor, pull the timing chain, all kinds of stuff to change the water pump. Brilliant, outstanding performance. All right, so, all right, let me make sure I'm on the right page here. But what we did here, we got that thing put on there because, watch this. See that? You have to mash that in. Now look at the verbiage I got up there. It's got a 2-stage piston. It's operated by oil pressure, but there's a spring between the second stage and the first barely visible stage, as you can't hardly see here. The piston is supposed to be pressed in and latched for installation, and pushing it a second time delatches it after the tensioner is bolted into place. Well, this one you couldn't push it all the way in. It would stick right there. And it's always supposed to have oil pressure pushing it out against the chain tensioner. You remember how those work, don't you, Adam? Well, that's the same kind of thing. And that one was hanging up, and there were times when it hung up and the chain would go whipping around and rattling and everything. See, we never touched this the first time we had our hands on the car. All right, and so here we go. That's what it looks like on the car. See it up there? That's the brand new chain tensioner. Now, I heard about an older guy that had seen several of these acting up like this, and he found a year model tensioner that was exactly like this, only it had the little ratchet in there, and he would put that in there to make sure you didn't have any recurrence of this kind of thing. Because over time, you know, the varnish and everything's gonna make stuff stick. Well, we got all of this done. We drove the car. It ran absolutely perfect. There was absolutely no noise. And then, lo and behold, it shows up with a different noise than the other two. This has got to be, you can't make this stuff up. All right, so I was listening around, and this noise was totally different. When you drive it, it would go down the road on it, you'd hear it, you know, start to make a noise, and this time it was accelerating, you'd hear it. and you'd hear it at different times, and it wasn't the same noise. And so I start listening with my stethoscope, and I hear it up in the dadgum bell housing area, and it's a flywheel that's cracked. So we got a cracked flywheel in addition to all this other junk that we had. When we finally got through with that car, it never made another noise, and as far as I know, they're still driving it, and that was like 6 years ago. But we went left and right, up and down, all around and about. Now then, now it's time for a pop test. Look at that question. See that? And on your note sheet, you're going to put the answers to these questions. Got it? A 4-cycle, 6-cylinder engine has a firing event every how many degrees of crankshaft rotation? 4-cycle, 6 cylinders. 120, because that's 6 into 720, right? 120 degrees. All right. We've already asked this the other day. Let's see who remembered it. 25 hundredths of a millimeter is equal to how much of an inch?
100. Or is that 1,000?
B. B.
Now, what is 1 millimeter equal to? In thousandths of an inch. 40 thousandths. 1 millimeter equals 40 thousandths. So 25 hundredths of a millimeter equals.
1 inch is 25.4.
Yeah, but we're talking about 25 hundredths of a
I know, but
millimeter.
I'm saying if you,
Yeah. You can extrapolate that out. Yeah. It's actually 10 thousandths of an inch. So it's one. If it's a fourth of 40 thousandths, it's going to be 10 thousandths. Basically, how that works. Make sure you can parse that. If you see an engine part that says 25 hundredths of a millimeter, read that as 10 thousandths. Okay, that's really important to know that, because with the bearings, when you're building engines that are metric and all, they won't have 10 thousandths, 20 thousandths, 30 thousandths on the bearings and stuff. They'll have hundredths of a millimeter. Retarded cam timing will do what to engine vacuum? Decrease. You did that the other day, didn't you? Or did y'all retard any cam timing? You didn't, did you? We talked about ignition timing, cam timing. Retarded cam timing will decrease engine vacuum, and in other words, 18 to 22 if it's running right. So when you start retarding the valve timing, it's going to go lower. You're going to lose some of your vacuum. Question 4. What are we doing with EGR? The purpose of EGR is to do what?
reduce NOx emissions.
Reduce NOx emissions. And if I did this right, I would have put a little X that was subscript down there by the NO. What's the purpose of valve overlap? Is it to make sure the valve doesn't leak after machining? Is it to allow the incoming intake flow to purge the remaining exhaust gas? Is it to increase volumetric efficiency? Or is it to prevent the valves from contacting the piston on the exhaust stroke?
B?
Hmm?
Is it B?
It's B. You're going to open that intake valve just right before the exhaust valve closes, in a normal, timed engine and all. Unless you got, things are going to change when you're doing your variable cam timing and all. But for the most part, the way engines are set up, right before the exhaust valve is completely closed and the piston's right up at the top on the exhaust stroke, the intake valve opens up and that air rushes in there and finishes purging the exhaust out of it. And Technician A says an engine knock always means something in the engine is loose. Technician B says a cylinder can have good compression rings and still consume engine oil. Can it burn oil if it's got good compression rings? I've already answered question A. Everybody remembers that I said an engine knock doesn't always mean something loose. But what about Technician B? I've already looked at my compression rings, and they look just fine. But which ring prevents it from consuming engine oil?
Is it the oil scraper?
The oil scraper ring, the one on the very bottom. And that would be this one here. And a lot of times on these pistons, when you take these pistons out on one that's been burning oil, this thing here will be so clogged up with crud and stuck and everything, the bottom one I'm talking about, that it will make it'll have no squeegeeing ability at all, and it can't get the oil off the cylinder walls, and it'll just start burning it up in there. Something else that can make one smoke and use oil, believe it or not, is a PCV valve that has come apart. It's just pulling air straight out of the crankcase and all,
So D.
So that was going to be B. That's right. Number 7, when exhaust emissions from a healthy engine are measured, what should read high while all the other gases read low?
CO2.
CO2. You're wanting the CO2 to be high. You want hydrocarbons, parts per million to be low. Your O2 is going to be low, your CO is going to be low. The reason diesel engine fires on compression is that for every pound of compression, the air charge is heated how many degrees? 2 degrees. If you got 450 pounds of compression, that's 900 degrees of temperature. You spray some atomized diesel fuel in a 900 temperature air, it's way past the flash point, it's gonna bust off. Technician A says torque to yield bolt stretch when they're torqued properly. What is a torque to yield bolt? Anybody ever use one of those? What are we talking about when we say torque to yield?
Where you torque it and you have to go like 90 degrees.
Very good. Yeah, you torque it and you go another 90 degrees. You've already had to do that on some, haven't you? That's right. Torque it and then, or you're going to go either 90 degrees or however many it's going to tell you. And on some of these head bolts and stuff, and I think it was that way on that one. You and Brian put them heads on there. You torque them and then untorque them and then you retorque them.
Yep.
And you have to, go to like 35 psi, following your pattern, and you back them off, then you go back down, then you go, and then you got a torque angle gauge, and you got to go even further. Now, Snap-on makes a really cool torque wrench that you can lay down here and let it neutralize so that it knows things, and you can literally put that on there, and it's got a screen on here, and when you pull it, it tells you how many degrees you're turning it. And then it'll go beep like this. Donnie's got one over there, and we were. When I was helping him when I was off one time, we were putting some timing chains on a single overhead cam Explorer. If you ever had to put timing chains on anything, a single overhead cam Explorer is probably the hardest one to do because you got to pull the motor out. They got a timing chain in the back, got a timing chain in the front. There's all kinds of stuff going on in there. No timing marks anywhere. You got to know how to use the tools to set them up. Everything's got to be torqued just right or it'll come apart. Technician B says torque to yield bolts should never be reused.
Both.
Both of those guys are right. If you got torque to yield bolts, if you look at that, and I'll tell you, I felt really silly when I was at the Lincoln Mercury place. I'd never seen a torque to yield bolt in my life. And this is crazy to me, and I don't want to launch anything here, but I'll pull the head off an Escort or a Trace or whatever, was working on the Lincoln Mercury place. And this was back '84. And I pulled that thing off, and it had an aluminum head and all that stuff, cleaned everything up, and don't even remember why I was changing that gasket, but I put it back on there. And I had a tendency to go, I'd flip over and I looked in the book. We didn't have computers then. I flipped in the book and it said, and I saw that you torqued a cylinder head of this pattern to 44 foot-pounds. And I said, well, that don't sound like a lot of torque on a cylinder head bolt, but oh well, so I closed it up because I'd read it in the book. I didn't read farther on down where it said you go another 90 degrees 2 times or whatever. And I put it out of there with just 44 foot-pounds of torque on it, and it never did come back, so that makes me sick to think about that. All right, let me see here. But what I started to say was, if you see that it has torque to yield bolts, like the 5.3 in these Chevys are torque to yield bolts, you're supposed to replace the head bolts, every time. Technician A says an engine with cranking compression of 140 psi on every cylinder should have a running compression of at least 200 psi on every cylinder. Who's done cylinder leakage testing so far? Remember that? Who's done running compression? Anybody done running compression test?
So
Sometimes you can find valve problems with a running compression test that you can't find hardly any other way. Really good. Technician B says a stuck shut IEC valve can indirectly cause a low compression concern. The IEC valve is stuck shut. Can that cause it to have low compression? This is a kind of a trick question. Yes or no? Anybody come up with anything? Ding, 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 ding. Need a lifeline?
I think if it was stuck open, it would have low compression.
No, not really. I'll tell you what happens. And you know how I had told you how the people that the used car lots will crank cars up and drive them around, move them from. They want to mix the cars up and put this one over here and that one over there, kind of like they're moving the merchandise around at Walmart. Because when you go by there, you might see a car you didn't see the other time we go by there. So because they crank it up and they move it over here, and they crank it up and they move it over there, and they crank it up and move it over here, and then the next thing you know, they've got it on the hook coming to the dealership or where shop or whatever. This car won't start. And so I'd walk out there and I'd hear it go to start it up. And I like to listen to one when I'm spinning it over and see if the compression sounds nice and even. I want it to go whoa, 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 like that. And if I hear it go whoa, 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 I know that one of the cylinders doesn't have any compression. You can hear it from across the shop and tell one of them cylinders. Or hear somebody start a car in a parking lot. You say, they got low compression on one cylinder on that car over there. And that's not the same thing as saying, like one morning my wife asked me, the car started up out in the neighborhood, and she goes, what is that? And I said, well, it's a 2003 Dodge Dakota 3.7 random misfire on cylinder number 3. And she says, no, it's not. And I said, well, I don't know what it is. I hear an engine starting up out there. What do you want me to tell you? Well, anyway, this particular one, you can hear it. But on that one, when I spun it over, a little 4-cylinder, low tension piston rings, different from the piston I was holding up a while ago. It would go, yeah. It had no compression at all. This, yeah. It's not like you was testing the starter. It's not like you're spinning over without spark plugs in it. What's your first thing that comes to your mind when you hear one like that? We're not talking about effect, I'm talking about cause. Timing belt. I'm thinking timing belt. You know, like timing belt, you ever heard one with timing belts jump? You know, you may have compression on one cylinder, but none of the rest of them. Well, this one here, like, it's just spinning free. A lot of times they do that. I said, well, before I sell these people a timing belt, I want to see if it's jump time. So I pull the covers off, and I want. What you do is you bring it up so that the cam timing marks are up where they're supposed to be. Once you line those up and you look at the crank mark, you know if it's in time or not. Now, don't line the crank mark up and look at the cam mark because they can be half out because they're turning only half as fast crank. So I line up the cam marks, look down there, see that and I saw, well, this thing's not out of time. I bet it's one of these lot lizard cars. And so I pull the spark plugs out and I, shot a tablespoon of motor oil down in each cylinder and spun it over with the plugs out and then put them back in and it fired right up. Now the IAC opens wide open when you're starting a car so that it's for no touch starting. The IAC opens wide open, you double pulse in your injectors to wet the manifold, it fires up. Let me ask you this, if the IAC is stuck closed and you're double pulsing the injectors, you're going to wash the cylinder walls down. Now on an older vehicle, like an old 302 or 350 or something like that, if the cylinder walls are washed down on one of those, and you've probably heard this if you've been around cars that have been parked in the barn for a while, you say, well, I'm going to try to get this car started so we can drive it. It's been sitting here since Granddaddy died. And you try to start it, and all the oil is gone from the cylinder wall. And you spin it over, and you go, rah, 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 rah. You ever heard that? It's real slow, and it's irritating as all get out because you want it to spin normal speed and start. But the cylinders, the doggone rings are dragging dry on the cylinder wall. Well, in the same way, you pull the plugs out, and you shoot you some, usually some automatic transmission fluid or something, type F. I say type F because you don't want silicone in the fluid to damage the oxygen sensors if it goes down in there. Put that in there and get them things started spinning normally, you'll get it to where it'll fire up. But if somebody's been trying to start one that doesn't have spark and they've been spraying fuel in there on an older one that's got the high tension piston rings like that piston I was holding in my hand a while ago, it's going to spin really slow. And a lot of times you won't even be able to get it started. This guy came one time, and I'm almost through here, knocking on my door at 6 o'clock on Sunday morning. And he says, my irrigation engine's been sitting out there all winter long, and I need to water my peanuts, and it's got a 455 Oldsmobile engine in it with points and all that. And he goes, I got some points and plugs in it, but I'm not confident enough that I can tune it up and get it running. And would you come down there? So we went down there and we chased the yellow jackets and the snakes and all that stuff away from the darn thing. It was sitting in knee-high grass. And I put points and I put plugs in there, and it was spinning like that. And the battery on the thing was pretty strong. But I took off the positive battery terminal, right? Took the positive battery terminal off of his, hooked the jumper cables from the truck to the positive battery post, and then I hooked the other one to the cable. Well, basically what I did was I hooked the batteries up in series to get him 24 volts. And it spun that thing up really fast and fired it up, and he was squirting water everywhere. And I charged him $20 when he took me back to the house, and he was really not happy because he thought that was too much. Well, anyway, at the end of that story was I saw him sitting out beside the road, broke down on his little truck about 3 days later, and he's out there trying to, his little Ford Courier, and he's fooling with it, trying to get it started. I can tell he wasn't going to be able to figure it out. And I said, what's wrong with this truck? He goes, no, it's all right, I'll get it. He's afraid I don't charge him. So I fixed the truck for him, and he asked me what I owed him, and I said, whenever you need help, I'll come and help you, but when you knock on my door at 6 o'clock on Sunday morning, you're going to pay me something. You know what I mean? Get me out of bed. Anybody got any questions or comments about that? Does anybody have people that want you to work on their car just because you like them? You have that? Or because they want to give you some cookies, or maybe you have some blueberries or something? You ever have that? What about you? You fix cars for people?
My grandparents.
Is that right? Well, we don't charge grandma, do we?
The only reason I do that is because I'm driving my grandmother's car.
Yeah, I got you. All right. Well, we're